Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Yesterday, I opened a letter that changed everything. For years, I thought my parents were broke when I begged them to help with my daughter's cancer treatment. They told me over and over that they wished they could, but they simply didn't have the money. I believed them because why would I not? They were my parents, and even though we never had the warmest relationship, I never thought they would outright lie to me about something that serious. But the truth I uncovered made me realize that while I was working double shifts, fighting with insurance companies, and sitting in hospital chairs with my daughter, they were quietly paying for my brother's kids to attend one of the most expensive private schools in town. When my daughter got sick, everything else in my life stopped mattering. The only thing that mattered was making sure she had the best shot possible, and I did what any mother would do. I threw myself into every option, every treatment, every drug trial, every payment plan. I sat in offices with doctors using words that felt like a different language, and I signed papers that locked me into bills I knew I would never pay off in my lifetime. Still, I didn't care, because this was my child. I asked my parents for help, not even a fortune, just anything to ease the mountain of bills, and every time the answer was the same. They were so sorry, but they had nothing to give. They cooked casseroles and told me they were praying, but when it came to money, they said their retirement was too tight and they couldn't risk losing what little they had left. I accepted that, even though it hurt, because I thought at least they were being honest. After she died, I was barely functioning. I went back to work only because sitting at home in her empty room was worse than staring at spreadsheets and insurance codes all day. Then one afternoon, I came home and found a letter in my mailbox that wasn't even addressed to me. It was meant for my mother, but the mailman must have slipped it into my slot by mistake. It was from the private school my brother's kids attend, and it was a tax statement for tuition payments made in my parents' name. At first, I thought it was some kind of clerical error, but the numbers didn't lie. Tens of thousands of dollars, year after year, while I was maxing out credit cards for chemo drugs. I couldn't breathe. I sat at my kitchen table with that letter in my hands, staring at the proof that every time my parents told me, "We can't help you," they were choosing not to. And it wasn't like they had picked between two equally desperate situations. They chose private school tuition over chemotherapy. They chose to make sure Ethan's kids had smaller class sizes and a tennis team, while mine had to wait for medications because I was arguing with billing departments. That realization broke something in me that I don't think can ever be fixed. I wanted to be absolutely certain before I confronted anyone, so I called the school and asked for the bursar's office, pretending I was just checking on tax paperwork. I gave my mother's name, and sure enough, the woman on the phone confirmed multiple years of tuition payments. She was even polite enough to say she would mail me a copy of the payment history, assuming I was calling on my mother's behalf. That was the moment I knew this wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate choice. As if that wasn't enough, I found out something even worse a week later. When I was battling with the hospital over payment plans, my father had originally co-signed for me. It was the only reason I got approved in the first place. But then, out of nowhere, I received a letter saying the cosigner had been withdrawn and the plan was canceled. I thought it was some kind of glitch, but I kept the letter because something about it bothered me. After I discovered the truth about the school payments, I pulled that old letter out again and looked closer. My father's signature was right there, canceling his support. That single decision raised my payments and fees so high that I had to beg charities to help cover prescriptions. And the whole time, he sat across from me at dinner, telling me he wished there was something he could do. I knew then that I wasn't just going to confront them. I was going to destroy the story they had built to make themselves look noble while letting my child die. I requested certified copies of every payment, every signature, and I sat down with an attorney to review the family trust they always talked about. That's when I discovered something almost unbelievable. The trust wasn't just for education. It had a clause that allowed for medical emergencies for direct descendants, which meant they could have legally used that money for my daughter's care. They didn't just fail me, they ignored the very rule they had set up. I remember sitting in that lawyer's office, holding the document in my hands, and thinking this was the most expensive mistake of my life. Not the bills, not the loans, not even the debt collectors who still call me every week. No, the real mistake was believing that my parents couldn't help when the truth was they wouldn't. And I realized I had proof in my hands that could shatter the perfect little image they had built of themselves as loving grandparents who had done everything they could. That night, I stared at the copies of those documents and knew exactly what I was going to do. I wasn't going to scream or beg or cry in front of them. I was going to line up the truth like ammunition, and I was going to drop it at the exact moment it would hurt the most. The day my parents thought they were sitting down for a nice family dinner was going to be the day their entire story collapsed. And as I sealed the folders with their signatures and payment histories inside, I whispered to myself that for the first time since losing my daughter, I finally felt a little bit of control coming back into my hands. I woke up the next morning with that heavy, electric calm that comes when grief stops stumbling and starts walking in a straight line. And as I poured coffee that I did not even taste, I decided that if my parents cared more about their reflection in other people's eyes than they ever cared about what my daughter went through, then I would move this conversation into the only rooms where their voices shake, which are the church lobby where everyone pretends to be kinder than they are, and the private school office where donations buy quiet favors and engraved plaques, because if they had chosen an audience over me, then an audience would hear what I had to say. I started with the church, not because faith had anything to do with this anymore, but because my mother loves being seen carrying a casserole and my father loves being thanked for picking up folding chairs after a fundraiser. And on the church's streaming page, I found the clip from the Sunday when my mother stood at the microphone and talked about how the congregation always rallies around families facing medical crises, and as I watched her smile and praise generosity while knowing that same week she signed a tuition check with the energy of a woman paying for tennis lessons, something inside me settled into place, and I downloaded the video and saved it in 3 different folders with a title I would not forget. Then I drove to the school because I wanted paper, not rumors, and in the bursar's office I asked, very politely and very clearly, for confirmation of tuition payments made by my parents under their full names, explaining that there was a tax discrepancy and I needed records for an accountant, and the woman behind the desk, who had the soft firmness of someone who has told hundreds of parents that late fees are not optional, typed for a while and then said she could send me an itemized history if I provided a mailing address, so I handed her a stamped envelope I had brought on purpose and watched her slide the documents inside. And before I left, I walked past the donor wall where names are carved into metal leaves and saw my parents' names positioned at a height where photographs land easily, and I stood there long enough to get the compulsion to tear the metal off the wall out of my system. Then went back to my car and called my aunt. Aunt Jo has kept every email any of us have ever sent because she believes families forget truth faster than they forget recipes, and when I told her what I had in my hands, she said she was not surprised, only angry that it had taken me this long to see it, then forwarded me an old thread where my parents announced the creation of an education trust for grandchildren and included a line that at the time everyone praised as thoughtful. A small clause about emergencies that affect direct descendants and require immediate financial attention, which is the kind of sentence you underline with gratitude when you first read it and later underline with a pen that is shaking because you realize it was never meant for you. That night, my brother called, pretending concern and then easing into the real ask, which was that none of this should get messy or public because kids are involved and reputations are fragile, and he tried a tone that used to work on me in high school. The confident push of a man who expects women to smooth the edges he leaves behind, and I listened to him say that I needed to be realistic about what treatments actually accomplish, and that maybe I had been chasing hope that was just a black hole for money, and I let him talk until the words ran out and then told him, very calmly, that we were going to have dinner at our parents' house on a night of my choosing, that I wanted him there with his wife, that I had already asked Aunt Jo, and that I would be inviting Pastor Neil because we should do this with grace, and I hung up before he could turn his voice into a weapon. I chose the date with care, a night when the church committee met earlier in the evening and often drifted to my parents' place for coffee and leftovers, because I wanted footsteps in the hallway and voices in the next room, not to humiliate anyone for sport, but to make sure that spinning would not be as easy as it usually is, and I sent an invitation message that said I wanted to say thank you for all the support after the funeral and to talk about how to help other families who face bills. Like mine, which is the kind of sentence that makes my mother pick out a blouse and my father polish a story. While the envelopes from the school traveled through the mail, and while the church video sat in my drive like a quiet grenade, I met again with the attorney to go over the trust. And she showed me the exact wording of the hardship clause and outlined what a formal accounting demand would look like. And as she dictated the names and the certified mail language, I felt a new steadiness crawl up my spine. The kind of steadiness that comes when you know the person who hurt you will not be able to scoot their chair back and escape the room, and I signed what needed signing and asked that copies be prepared in duplicate, because when this kind of truth arrives, it should never arrive alone. The day before the dinner, I sent a message to Pastor Neil that I would appreciate a short blessing to open the evening since we were gathering to talk about compassion and responsibility, and he replied with the polite enthusiasm of a man who loves a tidy moral. And I thought to myself that tidy was the last thing that was about to happen. Then I forwarded my brother a simple confirmation of the time, and he responded with a warning about family reputation that I screenshotted and placed at the back of a folder like a small, sharp tool, because sometimes the ugliest lines need to be read out loud in the exact voice that wrote them. Only 1% of people know the secret, I thought as I stacked the folders and slid them into my bag. Not because the secret is complicated, but because people do not read the fine print when they never plan to honor it. And when I locked my door and headed to my car, I knew that the next time we all sat at that table, I would not be pleading for understanding or forgiveness or anything that can be ignored. I would be presenting terms anchored in their own words and the dates they wrote on their own checks, and I would ask them a question so small it could be answered with a breath. A question that once spoken would make every other sentence in the room feel dishonest, and I promised myself that no matter how loud the objections got, I would not raise my voice. I would only raise the stakes. By the time the storm from my second round of evidence began to settle, I thought maybe, just maybe, they would recognize that this was a battle they couldn't win. But I underestimated how deeply my father had convinced himself that authority alone could bend reality to his will, because instead of retreating or even pausing, he escalated, and he did it in the most manipulative way possible, by trying to corner me with something that looked harmless on the surface, but was actually the legal equivalent of a loaded gun pointed at my own head. He called me one Saturday morning, said we should meet to talk it out, and when I arrived, he wasn't alone. He had a notary waiting in the living room, papers already printed, pen laid out neatly on the table. Like it was some kind of business transaction rather than an ambush. He explained, with that tone he uses when he thinks he's the reasonable one, that all I had to do was sign a temporary quitclaim deed, just to help Maya transition, just until she could get on her feet, and that later they could work out the rest. He said it as if signing away my rights to the property was no more serious than lending her a sweater, but Luis had already educated me on exactly how dangerous that document was, and I knew right away what was happening. Once my name came off the title, no matter how temporary he claimed it would be, I was done, and the chances of getting it back were slim to none. That was the trap, dressed up as family cooperation, and if I hadn't already been warned, I might have signed, because the way he framed it sounded so deceptively simple and generous. I looked at him, then at the notary who clearly had no idea she was part of a family war, and I realized how far my father was willing to go. This wasn't just about Maya anymore. This was about control, about him proving that he could still dictate the terms of my life, even though I had worked my way out from under his thumb years ago. And in that moment, instead of exploding with anger like he probably expected, I remembered something odd from years ago, something my mother had once slipped into conversation without thinking. She told me that when Maya was born, there was a mix-up at the hospital, that the intake form briefly listed a different last name before it was corrected later, and at the time I didn't think much of it, but now, with Aunt Nora's memory about the dates not lining up, the hospital error started to feel less like a clerical mistake and more like a clue, a breadcrumb I had ignored until now. So while my father pushed the papers across the table and told me to be a team player, my mind was already elsewhere, forming a plan. I wasn't going to yell, I wasn't going to storm out, and I wasn't going to cave. I was going to turn the trap back on him. I calmly told the notary that if we were talking about signatures, then I had my own document I wanted to sign first, and I pulled out a folder I had brought with me, one Luis had helped me draft. It was a simple agreement, nothing earth-shattering, but it required every family member involved to commit in writing that they would stop spreading false statements about my property, stop attempting to coerce me into transferring ownership, and agree that any future discussions would be handled through written correspondence only. I asked the notary if she could witness that instead, since apparently we were having a paperwork party. The look on my father's face was priceless, a mix of rage, disbelief, and panic, because he hadn't expected me to come armed with my own legal counterpunch. He tried to laugh it off, saying I was being dramatic, that there was no need for such official nonsense, but the notary, who clearly didn't want to be dragged into the family mess, simply shrugged and said she could notarize whatever documents both parties wanted. That was when he lost his temper, stood up, and said he wasn't signing anything and walked out, leaving the notary awkwardly packing up her briefcase. But here's the part that really mattered. It wasn't just about him refusing, it was about me setting the precedent that if we were going to play with signatures and official papers, I would not be the one cornered. I would not be tricked into signing away my life's work, but I would absolutely force him to see that I knew the game, and I could play it better. And as I drove home that day, clutching the unsigned agreement, I realized I had crossed a line too. I wasn't just defending myself anymore, I was preparing to expose him, and the only question left was how much of the truth I was ready to drag into the light. That night I filed a formal request for hospital records from the year Maya was born, citing the right to access as an immediate family member, and while I waited for the process to move, I ordered a mail-in DNA kit, one for myself, one for my mother. Because if the paper trail was as messy as I suspected, then science would close the gap. I didn't tell anyone, not even Luis, because this was something I needed to hold close until the time was right, and in my gut I knew that time was coming faster than anyone expected. I went to bed that night not shaken, not exhausted, but clear-headed, because for the first time in my life, I saw my father's strategy for what it really was: not love, not protection, not guidance, but control disguised as duty. And I knew that if I was going to win this war, I had to be the one holding the final document, the one truth he couldn't argue away, the one fact he couldn't rewrite with gossip or pressure. If we were doing signatures, then my signature would be the last one they ever got without my rules, and by then, the truth would be staring them in the face. The evening of the dinner arrived with the kind of tension that does not feel like nerves anymore, but like the final stretch of a long trial where every witness has already testified and all that remains is the closing argument. And as I walked into my parents' house carrying the folders that held years of lies condensed into neat paper packets, I could see the same carefully arranged dining room that had hosted birthdays, graduations, and holidays. Except tonight the table felt more like a stage, with my parents seated at one end pretending everything was ordinary, my brother already pouring himself a drink like a man determined to appear unbothered, and Aunt Jo quietly folding her hands in her lap as if she already knew there would be no blessing in this room strong enough to cover what was coming. Pastor Neil opened with a prayer about compassion and responsibility, his voice steady, his tone suggesting that he believed we had gathered to heal, but when I lifted my head I was not interested in abstractions about forgiveness, I was interested in facts. And so I thanked everyone for coming, slid the first folder onto the table, and began with the simplest thing: the hospital payment plan my father had co-signed, the cancellation letter with his signature, and the hospital's verification that his withdrawal had directly triggered penalties and higher fees, and I read the exact sentences aloud, not with anger or accusation, but with the clarity of someone who has been carrying evidence in silence for too long. And the room went still enough that the clink of my brother's ice in his glass sounded like a hammer. My father shifted in his chair and said there must be some mistake, but before the excuse could grow legs I opened the second folder and laid out the bursar's tuition records, line after line of payments covering years of private school tuition. And then I held up a photograph I had printed of the donor plaque with their names etched proudly into it, and I pointed to the exact date that coincided with the week my daughter's chemotherapy had been delayed, because I was waiting for a prescription charity to approve funding, and I asked how, in that same week, there had been enough money for a semester's tuition, but not a dime for medicine, and no one spoke for a long moment, because the numbers spoke louder than any of them could. When my mother finally opened her mouth, she said she had not realized how hard it was for me at the time, and that she assumed the hospital would find a way because children's hospitals always help families in need. And before I could even respond, Aunt Jo slid her own printout across the table, an email from years back where my mother had bragged to relatives that they were buying Ethan's children a future by funding their education, an email that used the exact word future, the very thing I had been fighting to secure in hospital rooms while they congratulated themselves for generosity, and I let the silence that followed do most of the work, because there are times when saying nothing is the sharpest way to cut. Then I read the hardship clause from the trust, slowly and clearly, every word written by their own attorney, explaining that the funds were designated for education unless medical emergencies for direct descendants demanded priority. And I asked the one question I had written down in my notebook because I did not want grief to make me forget it. When you said you had nothing, did you mean for me or for her? The room shifted, my mother lowered her eyes, my father clenched his jaw, and my brother scoffed as if I was making a scene, but no one answered, and that silence was louder than any denial they might have tried. At that point, I pulled out the final envelope, the one with the terms letter inside, and I read it without raising my voice, explaining that the money trail I had laid out tonight was not a request for pity, but a foundation for choice, and the choice was simple. Redirect a defined portion of the trust into a scholarship at the Children's Hospital in my daughter's name. Sign a written apology to be read aloud to the congregation that had once applauded my mother's speech about helping sick families, and commit that every future tuition distribution would be matched with an equal amount for medical hardship in the family, or else I would file the petition that was already prepared, attach every exhibit we had just reviewed, and deliver copies to the church and the school. I did not shout. I did not cry. I simply stacked the evidence and placed the letter on top of the pile, and I looked at each of them in turn, waiting to see whether they understood that this was not a negotiation but a final move. My father muttered about extortion, my mother whispered that I was tearing the family apart, and my brother pushed back from the table so violently that the chair slammed into the wall and dishes shattered onto the floor, the sound breaking the stillness like glass exploding in a quiet church. He stood over me, pointing his finger like an amateur lawyer, shouting that I was blackmailing them and that no judge would ever side with me, but his voice cracked halfway through, because deep down he knew that the documents in front of him were heavier than his words. The table literally shook with the force of his outburst, the plates sliding, the silverware clattering, and for a moment it looked like the dinner would dissolve into chaos. But I kept my voice steady and repeated that this was not about me being believed or pitied. This was about paper, signatures, and the story that would exist after tonight whether they cooperated or not, and as I gathered the folders back into my bag, my brother shouted again, his face red, his wife pulling on his sleeve to sit down, and my father slammed his palm onto the wood as though force alone could erase the words on the page. Can you guess what happened next? The answer was already written in every letter, every receipt, every clause of the trust, and as I stood to leave I knew the explosion at that table was only the beginning. Because the real detonation would come when the terms they had laughed at turned into the reality they could no longer escape. The moment the table exploded into shouts and the sound of dishes shattering against the hardwood floor, I realized that the confrontation I had been planning for months had reached the point where there was no possibility of turning back. And as my brother's voice cracked while he threw accusations across the room and my father slammed his palm against the wood in a performance of authority that no longer carried weight, I simply stood, gathered the folders, and told myself that what they mistook for extortion was nothing more than the truth they had been trying to bury under casseroles, donor plaques, and carefully polished reputations, and the more they raged, the calmer I became, because I knew that the real leverage had already been delivered into hands they could not intimidate, deny, or silence. Even as my mother's eyes filled with tears and she whispered that I was tearing the family apart, I could hear the knock at the front door, a sharp interruption that sliced through the noise. And when my father opened it, he found the courier standing with a thick envelope addressed from Attorney Grace Lynn's office, an envelope that contained the official petition for trust accounting and breach of fiduciary duty, time-stamped, signed, and filed that very afternoon. And the courier, who had no interest in family dramas, simply asked for a signature of receipt and handed over the paperwork that transformed everything we had just argued about into a legal process that did not care about feelings, only about documents, clauses, and accountability. And the look on my father's face as he read the first line told me he finally understood that the days of brushing me off as dramatic were over. Before he could form another excuse, I took out my phone and placed it on the table, opening the line to the private school bursar who had agreed to be on standby, and her clear, professional voice filled the room as she confirmed, without hesitation, that Ellen and Richard Collins had made full tuition payments for multiple years on behalf of Ethan's children, payments that were in the system, payments that were traceable, and that without those donor contributions the family would lose their renewal priority for the next academic cycle, which meant that the prestige my parents had worked so hard to purchase could evaporate within weeks. And I watched my mother grip the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles whitened as she realized that her standing among the private school parents was not just threatened, it was already collapsing. Then I turned the phone to speaker once more and dialed Pastor Neil, who I had warned would receive the evidence if the terms were refused, and he answered with the careful tone of a man already uneasy. And when I explained that the choice before my parents was simple, either they agreed to redirect a defined portion of the trust into a hospital scholarship in my daughter's name and issue a public apology to be read aloud on Sunday, or I would forward every document, every record, every email, and every withdrawal letter to the church board and allow them to decide what sermon should follow. It became clear to everyone at that table that this was no longer a private family disagreement, but a matter of reputation in the very community my parents relied upon for validation. And in that moment the bluster drained from the room like air leaving a punctured tire. My brother tried one last round of shouting, calling the proposal a scam and insisting that no judge would ever enforce such terms, but the words sounded thinner than before, and my father, clutching the envelope from the attorney, finally asked in a quieter voice if there was a middle path, some way to avoid complete destruction of the family's name, and that was the moment I knew I had already won, because the question was not whether they would comply, but how quickly they could salvage whatever dignity they thought was left. And so I repeated the terms calmly, adding only one additional clause, one I had held back deliberately, that the first transfer must go not to a faceless account, but directly to the Children's Hospital Foundation for the installation of a permanent plaque in my daughter's name, a marker that no one could erase or redirect, a marker that would stand as long as the hospital itself stood. The silence that followed stretched long enough that even my brother stopped pacing, and when my mother finally broke it, her voice was shaky but resigned, asking what the wording of the apology would need to say, and I replied that the apology would be written by me, read by them, and witnessed by their pastor, because the same mouths that had once declared their pride in supporting education needed to use those same voices to admit that they had failed their own granddaughter. And while they looked at me with a mix of anger, humiliation, and defeat, I could feel a small measure of justice settle in my chest, not because it brought my daughter back, but because it forced them to do something useful with the wealth they had chosen to squander. By the time the signatures were on paper, the terms agreed, and the courier gone with the confirmation, the fight had drained from the room, and as I gathered my bag to leave I did not feel triumphant in the way people imagine revenge feels. I felt something steadier, like the first breath after being underwater for too long, and I walked out without looking back, because I did not need to see their faces when the weight of their own choices finally settled on them. What mattered was that the money was moving where it should have gone all along, that the scholarship would bear my daughter's name, and that the story they had been telling about themselves would never again be told without the truth sitting in the middle of it like a stone no one could ignore. That Sunday, as promised, Pastor Neil stood at the pulpit and read aloud the apology my parents had signed, his voice carrying across pews filled with people who had once clapped for Ellen's speeches about generosity, and the words, though written by me, were spoken in their names, admitting failure, admitting deception, and announcing the creation of the scholarship fund. And while I was not there to hear it, Aunt Jo recorded the service and sent it to me, and I watched from the quiet of my apartment as the congregation shifted in their seats, as my parents bowed their heads, and as the pastor spoke my daughter's name with solemnity, linking it forever to the hospital that had tried to save her, and for the first time since I buried her, I felt like something in this world finally acknowledged what she had endured. I chose not to attend that service because I did not want their apology to be about me, and instead I sat with Dr. Alvarez in the hospital cafeteria, sipping coffee while nurses bustled around us. And when she told me that the scholarship funds had already been confirmed and that soon a plaque would be installed bearing my daughter's name, I felt tears rise not from grief, but from the strange relief of knowing that my parents' money, the same money that had been weaponized against me, was finally going to pay for life instead of image, and that was the kind of justice I could live with, even if nothing else could be fixed. This changes the rules forever, I thought, not because my parents said sorry, not because my brother sulked into silence, and not because the community saw them stumble, but because the resources they once used to deny and divide had been redirected into something permanent and undeniable. And even if they tried to spin the story later, even if they tried to rewrite what happened at that table, the truth would be carved in bronze at a hospital wall where every family who passes by will read my daughter's name and know that something good came from her struggle, and that, more than any apology or confession, is what finally made me feel like I had won.